Welcome to the Closed-Minded Podcast, where we read with an open mind in order to close it again on something solid. This is episode 2 of season 1, and I want to thank you so much for taking the time to listen. Today, we discuss a recent book that advocates for the importance of integrating two worlds that don't typically intersect, economics and Christianity. The book is called The Economics of Neighborly Love, Investing in Your Community's Compassion and Capacity. It's written by Tom Nelson, who's the senior pastor of Christ Community Church in the Kansas City metro area, and he's also the co-founder and president of an organization called Made to Flourish. It's a nonprofit that seeks to equip pastors on how to connect biblical Christianity with the study of economics. As I was reading Tom's book, a central theme that really drew me in is the importance he places on both capacity and compassion. It's not enough that we have warm and fuzzy feelings toward people struggling with poverty, and poverty means much more than simply the economic kind. In order to actually do something about it, in order to love and serve people in need effectively, we need economic and financial capacity. The story of the Good Samaritan from the Gospels is key here. Tom notes that in that story, one of the three men who encounter the guy robbed and beaten on the side of the road, the only one who stops to help is a businessman. Were he not engaged in commerce, he wouldn't have been able to pull out his American Express card in the first place and effectively open a tab at the inn to pay for the victim's recovery. Compassion in his heart just wasn't enough. He needed actual economic resources or capacity in order to take meaningful action. Tom writes, quote, "Embedded in Jesus' parable is an intentional contrast between the economic injustice perpetrated by the robbers, who wrongly take what is not theirs, and the economic goodness demonstrated by the Samaritan, who generously gives what is rightly his." Therefore, Tom argues that it's incredibly important for Christians to understand a number of important truths and the vast implications that come with them. For example, here are a few. The Bible assumes the existence of private property rights. A legal system that protects property rights and fairly enforces the laws is absolutely essential to a prosperous and a just society. Third, wealth is a gift with profound theological implications. We need to understand how it's created and how we should wield it. Of all of the economic systems out there, free market capitalism is the least bad one. It's the best option to empower people to rise out of poverty, to increase their own capacity and standard of living. The importance of virtue in a capitalistic system as a check against rapacious excess and exploitation. And then finally, greed can grow just as easily in a poor man's heart as it can in a rich man's. So along the way, through this book, Tom develops the concept of human flourishing and fruitfulness, and he expands it far beyond simple economic accumulation and into personal virtue and in how we live our lives, how we perform our vocations, how we serve our neighbors, etc. After I finished the book, I compiled a list of way too many questions that I could possibly engage Tom on, so I curated them down to a more manageable set, and that's what I talked to him about. So here's my interview with Tom Nelson. Hope you enjoy it. So I really appreciate your time and letting me pick your brain a little bit and talk through some of this stuff.
You bet.
So I read your book, this, Economics of Neighborly Love, and I found it really provocative and challenging in a lot of ways. And there were just some things that I wanted to talk through with you and ask you about. Broadly, there's sort of two categories for what I'm wanting to look at, and I guess you have that list in front of you. But the first is the increasing capacity and generosity. How do we do that? What does it look like? And then also some of the interactions and intersections of capitalism and Christianity. So
yeah, great.
I will just dive into those. And, the first ones involve, digging into, how do we catechize our hearts for generosity and using our capacity in faithful ways. So I see this weird, incongruence in our culture where, on one hand, we demonize the wealthy. There's a lot of, decrying the 1% or, tax cuts for the rich, or anybody who has wealth, wealth is somebody that is an enemy that we look down on. And yet at the same time, we've got this really strong drive to become wealthy and become one of those people that, on the other hand, 5 minutes ago, we were bashing. So if I pursue wealth, how do I do, a heart check on myself to ensure that, I'm seeking to increase my capacity for the right reasons, to love and to serve my neighbor, and, rather than to pursue my own comfort or my own pleasure and my own security?
Yeah, it's a great question. And first of all, I guess what I would say is that greed is something that is warned about in Scripture over and over again, and it's something we should take very seriously, that it is a deep danger to our soul and to our world. So I want to affirm what you're saying there. And I think also that it's not how much we have as much as what we have and how much it has of us. I'm not minimizing that the more we have in material wealth and power and access that often gives us, I think the more we have to be vigilant about the potential of it becoming an idol of our own indulgence or for whatever purposes. But I do want to say, first of all, that greed is a matter of the heart. It is a concern for all of us. And again, it's not primarily how much we have, it's how much of what we have has us. So I think we need to make sure we keep track of that theologically. And for those who have more material wealth, I mean, there are many different kinds of wealth, but have more material wealth that is monetized or placed in some, more real asset. I do think there are some things that we can do to encourage generosity and guard our hearts. A couple things I think are important is that spiritual disciplines are vital for us as apprentices of Jesus. And the ones that we intentionally engage in need to be disciplines that help us deal with potential idolatry or other issues of excess. So a couple disciplines that are really important when we have increased financial capacity or material wealth is the discipline of sacrifice and simplicity. So I think one of the things that we do when we are entrusted with greater capacity through our work and God's blessing and wealth creation, then we need to be very vigilant about the spiritual disciplines that bring wholeness to our soul. Sacrifice and simplicity allow the unleashing of generosity. And one of the practical ways, Seth, that I would say is that, and this is probably true of all of us, but the more wealth capacity you have, I think there needs to be external accountability. Often we don't have other people that look into our lives. We might share our deepest intimate secrets with them and sexual things or whatever, but money and our net worth and our tax returns and our giving records, that's off limits. And that's a sign that there's some potential idolatry there. So what I'd suggest is to have a handful of people, some board of advisors who you give complete access to in terms of your financial dealings, your spending, your giving, your net worth, your income, and that helps others guide you with accountability. So there's an external accountability that I think is important that protects you.
That's really interesting. So do you think that, the way that certain topics when it comes to money are taboo in our culture, and I would say that that's probably the case on both ends, when it comes to having a lot of wealth, and also when it comes to not, if you're unwise with your resources or you're poor or that sort of thing, I can easily imagine that being something that you don't want somebody looking over your shoulder for a variety of reasons. Do you think that is that just rooted in our sinfulness of either the greed on one hand with having a lot of wealth and not wanting accountability, or maybe shame for the way that we have used our resources if we don't have very many and we just don't want somebody looking over our shoulders?
I think that's exactly right. I think it can be in all spectrums. My point is just simply to say that when you have a great deal of resources, I think it's really important if you want to have a heart of generosity. But I think you're exactly right. I mean, I think we don't want to get access, well, we think to God, we can't pull over God's eyes, but to others in areas of where our idols lurk. And money, whether we used it well or poorly, or we're slothful, or we're poor investors, or we're good investors, we tend to put that off limits. And as we know, as followers of Jesus, nothing should be off limits to God or to those some people around us who know us well. We should live lives of transparency before God and others.
Yeah, that's really good. So just to kind of restate what you said a minute ago, what I'm hearing is that you're saying that spiritual disciplines are essential to sort of combat the idols of wealth. And a couple of ways to do that is through sacrifice and simplicity, because that allows you to unleash generosity. It disconnects you from maybe the entangling aspects that maybe wealth can bring. If you're so wrapped up in, the physical pleasures and the enjoyment of the material wealth, then it can be more difficult to give away or to use your capacity for, promoting the gospel or for bringing about, better living standards for someone else. And so sacrifice and simplicity help to unleash that generosity.
Yeah, I think that's well said. That's well said, Seth.
Great. So that connects to another author whose book that I read that I wanted to ask you about, because you had mentioned to him in a footnote in, I think, chapter 8, Craig Blomberg, and you had said that you disagreed with some of his exegesis about the tithe and analyzing the Old Testament. I have not read the book that you cited in particular, but I have read another one that he wrote, which is called Christians in an Age of Wealth. And that's basically a survey of all of the biblical texts that touch on wealth, poverty, economic stewardship, really however tangentially. If it's somehow related, he talks about it. And when he gets to the section on the tithe, his argument is that Christians are not morally obligated to give a specific percentage of their income, but rather that the giving should be sacrificial and that it should increase over time. So it's sort of a graduated scale or a progressive scale of generosity that he thinks makes more sense both practically and biblically. So, you look at a millionaire who gives away 10% of his income, that's a lot of money, but he might not feel it at all in the sense of it being sacrificial. Whereas you have somebody who's, living in abject poverty and they only give away 5% of their income to the church, and yet that's incredibly sacrificial. So, his basic point is that 10% figure is a straitjacket that the modern church has kind of imposed on itself, and it unnecessarily burdens some, it insufficiently burdens others, and then it fails to apply, his conception of what the relevant texts are saying. So my question to you, and we don't have to get into a theological argument about somebody else's point, but my simple question is just, do you agree with that general spirit of his recommendation, even if you don't necessarily agree with that exegesis of the text?
Yeah, well, I'd say, first of all, Craig is a wonderful person and a good scholar, so I want to affirm that. Yeah, I disagree a little bit with where he's going, but not the spirit. The spirit of progressive generosity is right on the money. I would just say that I think angling this idea of equal burden or unequal burden, I don't think that's the focus. It's first fruit design and worshiping God. And then I do think that there is, I probably see more of a continuity between the Old and New Testament. Jesus continually, the argument of no tithe is often in the New Testament, whether it's 30%, 10%, people get into that, or the argument from silence. It's just not in the New Testament, quote unquote. And I think that's really a weak argument. And Jesus continually raises the Old Testament bar. You watch him, on marriage and divorce and so forth. So we're going to get in a big argument, but I do think a tithe is not meant to be a straitjacket or a legalistic thing, but I think it's a foundational way of obedience, and it's a picture of first fruit giving God our best. So, but the spirit I'm with, I think there should be growing progressive generosity and simplicity and increased capacity to be generous the more you have.
So it sounds like there needs to be a distinction between what the text requires of us in terms of the spirit versus, maybe the 10% or any sort of number that somebody ultimately picks, which is going to be arbitrary no matter what, unless you find a verse that says Christians have to give this amount. Then really the number is really a practical guide or, somebody's recommendation for something that's measurable, trackable, easy to understand, not necessarily something that's a requirement from the text directly. Does that sound correct?
Yeah. I love the progressive spirit. That's the joy. Yep.
Yeah, I was really impressed. I just remember a section in that book where he was talking about how the increasing percentage amount of his income that he's been able to give away over 40 years, and it shamed me because I haven't been able to do that, but it was also challenging. So, great. So I want to transition into a couple questions about the intersection between capitalism and Christianity. There's some tensions there. I think there's some overlap there in terms of some of the assumptions in place in the Old Testament related to, private property and increasing capacity and all of that. So I don't know if you're a Lord of the Rings fan. I actually just finished reading the trilogy to my 9-year-old, and he loved it.
Good for you.
Yeah, it's been really fun.
Beautiful.
So one of the things that, I came away with just thinking about the Shire and having read the book recently is, we learn this about the Shire where the hobbits live. It's this idyllic, peaceful, prosperous community. But we realize after the fact that it's only that way because of the close guard and the protection that was provided by the Rangers, which is, the people led by Aragorn, who ultimately becomes the king who returns. So the hobbits are completely oblivious to all the conditions that are in place for their prosperity, how it's been cultivated for them. So not to stretch the analogy too far, but do you think American Christians have misunderstood or unfairly maligned the capitalist underpinnings of our prosperity? So, when you look at global poverty and the way that it's declined, something like 90% or so over the last 40 years, and in many parts, that's just directly due to the incredible rising tide that capitalism has brought and entrepreneurship has brought to the world. I've heard Arthur Brooks discuss this in particular. Why is capitalism so demonized? And for the problems that do exist, should we trace those back to the system itself, or do we just need to nail those to the sinful human heart?
I think it's a really great question, and it's probably multifaceted of why. I'm glad you pointed out that the free market has played a very significant role in poverty alleviation around the world in the last few years, last 10 years, 20 years, depending on how you slice it. I think that really needs to be said. So I think there's several reasons, at least in my thinking, and it's not comprehensive. I think, first of all, there is a growing sense of wealth inequality, if you want to use that language, and the media really highlights that. Yet it is selective because a lot of the media doesn't highlight the wealth inequality of actors. I have a son that's in LA as a playwright, and the difference in Hollywood of the actors and the who's who versus all the hoi polloi that are trying to survive by waiting tables. But then corporate leaders, CEOs, are maligned for the great amount of salary they have versus the working person. I think it's a significant thing. I think Christians should be caring about that. Paul will talk about fairness. Fairness is an important idea in Scripture, but I think the media particularly points out the extremes of abuse. We also have a history of, some of the early industrialists and the idea of where unions rose because of abuse. So there's a history of abuse, of power and monopolies and things like that. So I think there's some evidence of that in our past, and people tend to lock into that. But I would say people are just ignorant mostly of economic principles, how wealth is created. Most haven't had a good economics class. They don't know incentive, responsibility. And many people have an enamorment with not just wealth inequality, but poverty equality. When you look at socialism, central control government, that there's poverty equality. That's not, everybody's poor. So people talk about that. So, I think there's a lot of things there, and I don't think followers of Christ should just be enamored with free market like it's the savior, because free market requires virtue and sin is a part of that. But it is the best, worst system that we know of. And it's truly remarkable what God is allowed to do through loving our neighbors to the market economy, a free market economy. So yes, it needs to be thought through carefully. Government has a role to protect abuse at some level here, but I do think that people are ignorant about economic well-being and wealth creation, and there's a certain media selectivity, and they haven't thought through the issues and are enamored with kind of a socialistic equality, quote unquote, but don't see the poverty equality that comes with it often. And then does that make sense? I think people have a sense that they know people abuse power, so there's a few greedy people that are trying to, fill their pockets, but they don't understand that Walmart, for example, is the greatest poverty alleviation company in America.
Yeah. Well, the thing that always confuses me, or that it's never clear to me, how to engage on this issue of inequality. Like on one hand, if you stay at 30,000 feet, you can see, okay, yeah, there, maybe people are getting poorer and the richer are getting richer. But that's extremely vague. And the question is, where do you go from there? And my problem is, what's the end goal? Like, what's the end game? Because it's one thing to just say in general that there's this gap, but if you could design your perfect system, and this is not directed to you, this is directed towards some of the people that are preaching about against inequality. I'm like, okay, so I understand that there is a problem here, but what's the goal? Where do you want to get to? Like, if your goal is perfect equality, well, that's never going to happen. So I'm going to challenge your premise there, and so maybe I'm not going to be as concerned as you are about wealth inequality. But somebody could say, well, it's 80-20 now, and I want it to get to 70-30. Is it 55-45? Like, I need to know what the end game is and how that's justifying your policies that you're proposing. But nobody can seem to answer that question about what it actually should be like, and how do you measure that?
Right, and they haven't thought about, I think many times, is that we have a good historical framework of forced poverty, equality, and the misery that means in a very command-control socialistic economy. I don't think we've thought enough about that. So I agree with you. I'm just saying I don't think we've talked enough about systems that have poverty, equality, and what a misery they are.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask you about crony capitalism and just sort of this marriage that often exists between corporations and government power. To my mind, capitalism works best with virtuous people. So, if you're going to give people freedom to enter into transactions and give people freedom to, use wealth in a lot of different ways, then if they're not virtuous, it's going to wreak havoc on people's lives. And so, the question becomes, how do you restrict that? How do you, naturally restrain the selfishness of man? And I'm concerned with using, government coercion to do that because it's inevitably corruptible. And I'm more likely to, identify with the values of a free market system because, they inherently restrain that selfishness of man. They limit its effects. And they can even be harnessed, despite, the motives of a particular person, they can still be harnessed for overall social good. When transactions are free, when contracts are enforced, private property rights are protected. And really, the primary role that I see the state playing is sort of monitoring the weights and measures, to use Old Testament language, where, contracts are enforced and, that sort of thing, not necessarily picking winners and losers. But I see a whole lot of just crony capitalism, or as I prefer to call it, crapitalism.
Yeah.
What do you suggest we do about that?
Well, I think you're exactly right. I mean, I don't think I have any more wisdom. You've framed the issues. It's one of the potential dangers that lurks in a free market system. We have that in any system. People take advantage of it, and they do not have the virtue. So I think 3 or 4 things are important here. I agree wholeheartedly that any system, for it to work well, requires virtuous people. And any freedom, free market requires that. So to me, it's a really challenge to the local church and to the church and society and other institutions of how do you nourish virtue and create deterrence from sort of just a complete narcissistic, hedonistic approach to life on individual players in an economic system. But I think 3 things. One is exposure by the press. I think there's a good potential, if the press does its work, to expose the extreme kind of collusion and crony capitalism so that there's some watchdog. Again, that's a stewardship the press has to do well, and I'm not always sure that's the case, but I think in the American experiment, the press has a role here of exposure. And I agree with you, the government has a certain protective role of kind of being the referee, making sure, not interfering, but making sure rules are followed. And then I think the virtue development has to be a part of institutions, whether it's education and primarily the local church, to help nourish virtuous people. I don't think there's a simple answer to that, but I think it involves at least those 3 things.
So this is one that I have struggled with. This next question. So, because I think we're on the same page about, capitalism is the best economic system that exists. And, or as it said, it's the worst one that exists except for all of the others.
Right.
And yet there's this necessity that, people be moral in order for it to work well and for abuses to be minimal and all of that. So as we've seen sort of our culture progress away from any influence or foundation on biblical principles, biblical morality, and the sort of virtues, I'm worried about whether that bodes ill for the future of capitalism and free markets when we have a society that is increasingly secularizing and immoral. How does that connect with the system?
So say that again just a little bit for me. Help me understand. I was a little confused in your question.
Right. Okay. So we know that the laws of supply and demand are amoral, which is why it's really important that our economics and the people in them are informed by virtue. So when they aren't, so when we see our culture that's moving progressively away from any sort of biblically informed virtue, or we see these really heinous injustices like the modern slave trade or sex trafficking, what does that say about the future of capitalism and a free market system when our culture is going that direction, and a good free market system requires virtue?
Yeah, I mean, that's helpful. Thank you for restating that, because I do think that the free market, for it to function really well, requires a virtuous people and virtuous players in the system. So I agree with you. I think increasing secularization, to use Charles Taylor and some other thinking about the immanent frame, I think secularization without a sense of virtue formation profoundly turns inward in terms of self-aggrandizement, not self-control. Selfishness versus self-interest. So I would just say that I think secularization of any kind bodes ill for any system because it turns so selfish, so inward. But I think a capitalistic free market system is probably the most challenging for it because, again, the emphasis of selfishness versus self-interest, if it becomes selfishness versus self-interest, I think it can really implode. So I would say yes. I think government is going to want to take over when there's not virtue, right? Superman's going to want to come in and dictate it. It takes out incentive. It takes out human dignity. It takes out opportunity, personal responsibility, right? These things get extracted out of it. And as many people said, when Superman comes, God the Father is pushed out as our provider. So, yeah, I think increasing secularization has profound implications for faith, for our culture, but also our economic exchange. I agree with you.
I don't know if you've read Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. Have you read that?
Yeah, I've seen a summary of it. I've not read the whole thing.
It's great. So my understanding or my summation of it is basically he's just riffing off of one piece of advice and applying it to a bunch of different scenarios. But that summation is always look to the unforeseen consequences of a policy, the ones that are around the corner that you don't necessarily see immediately, since those are the ones that often do the most damage. And then he goes and applies that in a bunch of different situations. It's a really, really great book. But my question to you is, what's the best way to respond to someone who sees an expanding regulatory and welfare state as compassionate, and they see in reverse a free market approach as being cold-hearted and exploitative? How do you respond to somebody on a human level to communicate that?
Well, I think they're responding to something that can be the case. I mean, a free market approach without virtue can be corruptive. It can be indifferent and selfish. It can be exploitative, using power, economic power over others for a short-term gain rather than long-term. So I would just firmly say, yeah, it can be. But then I would question more this sense of the welfare state as compassionate. What do we mean by compassion? You can meet an immediate need, but you can destroy people's dignity, their opportunity, their incentives, and so forth. So the idea of what is compassionate has to be unpacked a little bit, right? I mean, so I think that's where, when other people thought about, when helping hurts, when we have very short-term myopic understandings of poverty alleviation, we have, an example in America under, the Great Society of LBJ, whatever happened, this whole Great Society with good intention, we have a history that didn't really bring human flourishing. This welfare state more and more, it actually destroys families because there's lots of reasons why it destroys families, economic opportunity, incentive, and so forth. So it's a short-term gain with long-term pain. And that's not compassion. It's foolishness. So there's a place for immediate need. Yeah, immediate. Like I'd say real quick, there's a place for the Christians should care deeply about an immediate response to a crucial need, but that's not the long-term solution in terms of sustainability of meeting that need.
Yeah. And I think to add and sort of restate some of what you said, I would say that what's really important is that we get terms defined, and we get them defined biblically, not under some other rubric. So taking it out of the economic realm and just talking about your relationships. I see all the time in the culture, somebody's like, well, you just need to accept, choice A or lifestyle A, and because Jesus says to love people, and, so do what Jesus would do. And I'm like, whoa, let's step back here. Let's define love. Let's define best interest. Let's define compassion according to what the Bible says. And then that answers the question of how do we respond to this person in that situation? Right. That's really well said. Spot on. All right. Well, I really want to respect your time. So I've got one more question for you. I liked the quote from your book where you say, you cannot help your neighbor if you do not understand economics well. So my question is, if you have a congregant, approach you tomorrow and he says, look, I've read your book, but I want recommendations for, economists to read or popular level thinkers to engage with to, begin my education in this new realm of connecting economics and faith. Who would you recommend?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Thomas Sowell just for basic terminology and basic structure. But a couple of books that are newer that I think would be helpful, that I've been influenced by a lot, is there's a whole school of thinking called the Economics of Mutuality. It's at Oxford now, but there's a book out with this group that started in the Mars Corporation, and it's called Completing Capitalism. By Bruno Roche and Jay Jacobs, and they're trying to bring the triple bottom line, using that kind of language, or quadruple bottom line, to say that free market, for it to do really well, needs to make sure that all actors are respected and thought through from supply chain. So it moves away from just a rigid one bottom line of maximizing shareholder profit to see that there's a multiple discipline stewardship, a multiple bottom line. That's not new language. But I think the School of the Economics of Mutuality, now highlighted at Oxford University, is a really good place to start. And this book, Completing Capitalism, is accessible. It lays out some of the principles that I think are really helpful. Another book that I really like, and I think is really thoughtful, is John Mackey's book. I think it's Raj Soda or something is his co-author. But if you remember, John Mackey helped launch Whole Foods, that's now been brought together under Amazon's leadership. No, that's a whole other story. But John Mackey, I think, he's certainly very sympathetic to kind of an Eastern philosophy, not a Christian philosophy, maybe Buddhist thinking. So just to keep that in mind. But he really highlights the goodness of capitalism. That is what I call more humble, more whole, more thoughtful, not just rigid or focused on one bottom line. And he lives out his experience at Whole Foods in a way that I think is really attractive without diminishing the free market. He's very strong in the free market, but he brings a wholeness, human touch to it, more chastened capitalism that I think might be helpful. So they're written differently, but they're two books that I think are accessible, and one, both the Economics of Mutuality School and Completing Capitalism is more the theoretical. I'd say John Mackey's book is also very practical. A couple books.
Great. I'm familiar with John Mackey. I haven't read any of his books, but I know his name from Whole Foods and all of that, and I know the healthcare debate. He's had some input. So Great. I will check those out for
Yeah,
sure.
and again, he's coming from, I think, an Eastern viewpoint, Buddhist or something. But I think John has a lot of good intersections with our Christian faith and loving our neighbor and the goodness of all the stakeholders in the supply chain.
Great. Well, and I love, there's always opportunity with Common Grace for people to have, insights that are correct, even if they don't share all of our same premises and commitments.
Right. Well said, Seth. Well said.
All right. Well, Tom, thank you so much. I really appreciate your help and your time.
Seth, great to interact with you. Keep up with us. We'd love to see what you're doing, and I'd love, when you get your podcast ready, I'd love to listen in a little, and just hopefully I can cheerlead you on, because I love your thought. Thanks for being such a thoughtful follower of Jesus. That encourages me as a pastor more than you know.
And that will do it for episode 2. Check out the show notes page for this episode at closemindedpodcast.com/2, and you'll find links to Tom's books there, as well as the organization that he leads, Made to Flourish. Again, that's closemindedpodcast.com/2. If you want to be updated when new episodes go live, please subscribe in iTunes or Stitcher, Google Play, or whatever app you use for consuming podcasts. And with that, go forth with an open mind, but remember to close it on something solid. See you next time.
I wish upon you truth, and all you feel is doubt. I hope you know that an open mind still knows when to shut things out. I wish upon you a brave heart that will always rise above. But most of all, I